Usually when we talk about like a massive, passionate undertaking, um, maybe like launching a tech startup or organizing a global political movement or even, I don't know, a massive disaster relief effort.
Yeah.
There's this inherent expectation of structured precision.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
It's like building a commercial skyscraper.
Right.
You have a blueprint, you lay the foundation, you calculate the load-bearing walls, and the architect just sort of points to the schematic and says, there it is. That's the plan. Execute.
Right, because it's calculated. I mean, it relies on this highly visible step-by-step progression that limits variables and, maximizes efficiency.
Yeah.
We take a lot of comfort in that kind of visibility.
We really do. But then you step into the world of nonprofits or volunteer organizations or specifically religious ministries, and suddenly that blueprint just vanishes. You walk into the room, and instead of a schematic, you're met with this overwhelming, almost palpable sense of urgency. We're looking at an organizational landscape that is like often running entirely on pure, unadulterated passion.
Yeah.
It's an environment where the strength of your emotion is basically treated as the primary qualification for leadership.
Which, if we're being honest, is the absolute definition of flying blind.
Yeah.
I mean, relying on passion to build a sustainable organization is it's like trying to fuel an airplane with adrenaline.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's a great way to put it.
It might make your heart race, right? But it's not going to keep you in the sky for very long.
Exactly. And that profound disconnect, that gap between deep passion and actual execution is why we are here today. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are talking directly to you, the learner, because today we are unpacking a fascinating, highly comprehensive source document titled How to Build Your Mission's Ministry Map.
Yes.
The central thesis of this text really explores why organizations and this document look specifically through the lens of churches so often fail at their highest, most noble goals. And the spoiler here is critical, They don't fail because they lack compassion.
Right. They definitely care.
Right. They don't fail because they don't care enough. They fail because they simply do not have a map.
Yeah, and we really need to set the context of this material right up front. Because the source we are pulling from today is deeply theological.
Yeah.
It's a text written explicitly for church leadership, and it's focused heavily on global and local missions. But what makes it so compelling, and really why we are diving into it today, is that the insights it uncovers about human behavior and organizational drift, the psychology of groups, and strategic execution, those things are universally applicable.
Completely universal. I mean, if you are listening to this right now, whether you're trying to manage a secular business or maybe organizing a community garden project or running a school board or honestly just trying to strategically direct your own personal life, moving from a state of vague good intentions to actionable, measurable blueprints, it's just a masterclass in stewardship. This document takes the invisible assumptions that, silently govern group behavior and drags them out into the harsh light of day.
Yeah, so think about your own workplace or community group as we discuss this, because every group has hidden mechanics. And this text forces us to look at the machinery beneath the mission statement.
So let's dig right into the core friction the document identifies. It argues that most passion-driven organizations fail because they lead from habit and emotional impulse rather than clarity.
Right.
They possess what the author calls a burden, which is this heavy, undeniably real emotional desire to help a situation.
Yeah, a burden.
But they completely lack a blueprint, which is a specific, measured, faithful plan of execution.
And the author introduces a concept here that I found incredibly sharp: motion without mission.
Oh, I love that phrase.
It's so good. Because it is entirely possible, and in fact very common, to have a group of highly dedicated people where the raw activity level is constantly increasing, yet alignment is completely absent.
Like they're running on a treadmill.
Exactly. You have people working 70-hour weeks, sending thousands of emails, launching initiative after initiative, but the needle isn't actually moving on the core objective.
Okay, let's unpack this. I have to play devil's advocate here, though. Let's look at the tech startup world, for example.
Okay.
The prevailing wisdom there is often, move fast and break things.
Yeah.
It's all about rapid iteration. You take messy action, you see what sticks, you pivot.
Right.
So why is this document so utterly opposed to the idea of just jumping in and taking messy action? Like, if a neighborhood needs help, shouldn't we just run in and start helping rather than sitting around a boardroom drawing a map?
It's a great comparison, but the mechanism of a tech startup and the mechanism of a ministry, or really any volunteer organization, they are fundamentally different.
How so?
Well, when a startup moves fast and breaks things, they are testing a product against a market to find financial viability. They're burning venture capital to buy data.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But when a church or a compassion-driven organization moves fast and breaks things, what they are breaking is usually human trust. They're breaking volunteer burnout and the fragile emotional goodwill of the community they are actually trying to serve. You can't just pivot away from a broken relationship with a marginalized neighborhood the way you pivot a software app.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. The cost of failure isn't just lost capital, it's lost human connection.
Precisely. And the text points to a historical biblical warning in the book of Romans, chapter 10, verse 2, which speaks of a people having a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge.
Zeal without knowledge.
Right. In a practical organizational sense, zealousness cannot substitute for knowledge. If you have undefined compassion, just a general vague desire to do good, it doesn't merely fail to help. The text argues it actively produces waste.
Active waste.
Yes, it scatters your finite human resources across far too many disconnected initiatives. It creates a fragmented narrative where nobody in the organization actually knows what the main goal is.
Okay, it makes me think of an analogy.
Let's hear it.
Imagine a city firehouse, right? And it's full of incredibly brave, physically fit, deeply passionate firefighters. They have a massive burden to save people. It literally keeps them up at night.
Hmm.
But they refuse to use a city map, and they refuse to use a dispatch radio.
Oh, boy.
So the moment the garage doors open, they just jump in the truck and start driving frantically toward every single wisp of smoke they see on the horizon. Someone's burning leaves in their backyard. They rush there with the sirens blaring.
Brave.
A factory is venting steam a mile away. They slam on the brakes and rush there. They are moving incredibly fast. They are dripping with sweat. They feel entirely heroic. But they eventually run out of water and diesel gas before they ever reach the actual raging house fire they were supposed to be putting out.
That's brilliant. And if you were to criticize those firefighters, they would probably be deeply offended.
Oh, absolutely.
They would say, look at how hard we are working. Look at how much we care. Because the busyness feels like faithfulness. The noise of the sirens feels like impact. But at the end of the day, as you said, you have a scattered effort, an empty tank, and a house that burned down.
Exactly.
That is the exact mechanism of undefined compassion.
But let's look at the psychology of the people driving that fire truck. Because I think a lot of people listening to this deep dive right now might feel a bit defensive hearing this critique of good intentions.
Yeah, that's fair.
In our modern culture, we usually treat good intentions as the absolute highest virtue. If someone's heart is in the right place, we give them a pass on almost any logistical failure. We say, well, yeah, they meant well. Why is this text so ruthlessly hard on good intentions?
What's fascinating here is how the text explicitly confronts what it calls the hidden sin of vague good intentions.
Hidden sin. That's strong.
And that phrasing is highly intentional. In this framework, good intentions aren't just insufficient. They can actually become an illusion that protects a group from actual obedience and accountability.
Wait, protect them from accountability? How does caring about something protect you from accountability?
Think about it mechanically. As long as an organization is feeling a warm, generalized burden for the world or the poor or the unreached, they feel spiritually and morally active. The feeling itself becomes the reward.
Oh, I see.
But a vision that remains vague cannot guide specific action. The text argues that a burden simply says, we care, but a blueprint says, this is how we will care faithfully, and this is how we will measure if we are actually helping.
Right. If you never define the target, you can never miss.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. If an organization only relies on the emotional high of good intentions, it never has to do the hard, humbling work of looking a volunteer in the eye and saying no to their pet project.
Right.
It never has to allocate real, finite dollars to a spreadsheet. It never has to measure actual fruit. Good intentions become a psychological shield. If you fail, you just retreat back to, but our hearts were in the right place.
So feeling deeply troubled about the state of the world isn't a strategy. It's just an emotion.
It's an emotion that quietly produces institutional waste.
Wow.
The text notes that this is why churches will often start a dozen different programs over a 5-year period and finish absolutely none of them.
That is so common.
Right. They sponsor projects that are emotionally compelling in the moment. Maybe a famous speaker comes to town and hypes up a specific cause.
Yep.
But these projects are strategically completely disconnected from the church's actual long-term reality. And the tragedy, as the author points out, is that this kind of fragmented ministry still looks incredibly busy. It even looks generous on paper. But the author draws a hard line. Busyness is not the same as biblical faithfulness.
So if vague intentions and mere frantic activity are actually destructive, if they just leave us out of gas on the side of the road with a false sense of accomplishment, then what is the alternative?
That's the big question.
How does an organization shift from a feeling to a framework? And this leads us directly into the second major theme of our deep dive. The text elevates the concept of strategy from a dry corporate buzzword to a profound spiritual discipline. It actually calls it the theology of strategy.
And this is where the author has to dismantle a very common, deeply ingrained bias. Because in a lot of religious circles, or honestly in any highly idealistic nonprofit, there is this underlying belief that strategy is somehow a secular intrusion.
Yeah.
People view strategy as worldly control being smuggled into sacred spaces.
Right. The idea that if you are truly relying on inspiration or truly relying on the Spirit, you shouldn't need a spreadsheet. Like spreadsheets are for Wall Street, intuition is for ministry.
Exactly, but the text argues the exact opposite. Strategy isn't a lack of faith. It is wise administration of what you have been given. Building a map is treated in this document as a literal act of worship.
Calling a strategic map an act of worship is a massive paradigm shift. Unpack the mechanics of that. How does drawing a boundary line or setting a budget become an act of reverence?
Well, because making a map is fundamentally a confession of your own finite nature.
Oh, interesting.
It is a way of a community collectively saying, God is infinite, but we are not. Our energy is finite, our bank account is finite, our time on earth is finite. We cannot do everything, and therefore we must be incredibly deliberate with the specific resources we hold in our hands.
That makes a lot of sense.
And the author dives into some vivid historical and biblical precedents to prove this point. God's mission in Scripture is never, ever presented as chaotic. The act of creation itself is an act of bringing order out of a void.
The text actually brings up the historical figure of Nehemiah, and I think analyzing his approach provides a perfect case study for this. For context, for you listening, Nehemiah was an exiled cupbearer to a Persian king who learned that the walls of his ancestral city, Jerusalem, were in ruins. Now, he had the burden. The text says he sat down and wept for days. But he didn't just stand outside the ruined walls of Jerusalem and cry.
No, his emotional burden was just the catalyst. What he did next was entirely strategic.
Right. He went out at night in secret, and he physically inspected the walls. He measured the damage, calculated the scope of the ruin, and then he meticulously assigned the labor. He didn't just say, everyone grab a rock and start building wherever you feel led. He assigned specific families to rebuild specific gates right in front of their own houses. He did the math. He engineered a supply chain.
His burden became visible through structure. His vision was viewed as deeply spiritual precisely because it was obediently ordered. And the text also points to the Apostle Paul, who is arguably the most famous missionary in history. We often have this romanticized image of Paul as this restless wanderer, just walking into the desert in sandals, hoping for the best, acting entirely on random spiritual impulses.
Yeah, I think he's the ultimate improviser.
Right. But the historical record shows something entirely different. Paul was a brilliant strategist. He studied the demographics of cities. He targeted major Roman trade routes so that his letters and ideas would travel faster via merchants.
That's incredibly deliberate.
Very deliberate. He engaged specific groups of philosophers in Athens and specific tradespeople in Corinth. He made logical plans. And yes, he allowed the Spirit to redirect him. I mean, the book of Acts is full of moments where he is prevented from going to a certain region.
Right.
But the crucial distinction is that the Spirit was redirecting a moving vehicle that had a planned destination. He wasn't sitting in a parked car waiting for an emotional feeling to tell him to hit the gas.
That distinction completely reframes the modern fear of bureaucracy and passion projects. I think anyone who has started a grassroots initiative fears that planning will replace their reliance on their core mission. They think structure kills the magic of the work.
Exactly.
But the text flips this entirely. Planning is how you rely on your mission responsibly. True humility is recognizing you don't have the capacity to wing it.
The author states it beautifully. A map does not replace prayer. It gives prayer a specific focus. A map doesn't replace compassion. It gives compassion an actual direction.
Wow.
The resistance to planning, when you really drill down into the psychology of it, is often just a disguised desire to avoid the pain of evaluation. Because the moment you draw a map and put an X on a specific target, you can be evaluated a year later on whether or not you actually hit it.
So what does this all mean for the actual people involved? I want to press on this because there is a very real dark side to extreme organization. If we are making maps, drawing demographic boundaries, creating spreadsheets, and targeting specific populations, doesn't that inherently risk turning human beings into cold metrics?
It does.
You know what I mean? The risk of turning a suffering neighborhood or a complex community into just a color-coded data point on a quarterly PowerPoint presentation for a board of directors.
That is the exact danger, and to the author's credit, the text is highly aware of it. It offers a critical warning section titled, Mapping the Nations Without Losing the Heart.
Okay.
The author insists that the strategy must remain what they call cruciform.
Cruciform, that's a heavy theological word. Break that down for us mechanically. What does a cruciform strategy look like on a Tuesday afternoon in a planning meeting?
Well, cruciform literally means cross-shaped. In theology, it refers to the self-giving, sacrificial love demonstrated by Christ.
Right.
So, applied to organizational strategy, a cruciform map is one shaped by sacrifice and service, not by managerial pride or a desire for dominance.
Okay, that makes sense.
In the corporate world, you map a demographic to dominate market share or extract revenue. In a cruciform strategy, you map a demographic specifically to understand how to serve them with fidelity.
So the data collection isn't predatory, it's empathetic.
Precisely. The text notes that when Jesus looked at crowds, he didn't see an aggregate mass. He had compassion on the individuals within it. He asked people direct questions about what they needed. He wept at the grave of a friend. The author argues that if your strategic map reduces unreached peoples or the homeless population downtown into mere categories to be managed, the strategy ceases to be Christian. The best strategy has to hold attention. It must be warm with love, but sharp with clarity.
Warm with love and sharp with clarity. I love that framework. The goal of gathering all this data isn't to make the people you're serving smaller. It's to help the organization love them more specifically, in ways that actually matter to their daily reality.
Exactly.
So to build a map that actually honors people, rather than flattening them into statistics, an organization has to start gathering real-world data. But the text is very clear. You cannot just harvest vanity metrics. You can't just count how many people show up to an event and call it a day.
Right.
You need the right data, and that starts by looking at the very ground you are standing on. Which brings us to the core architecture of the document. It outlines 6 specific layers of data an organization must gather.
And we should walk through these layers carefully because they build upon each other logically.
Let's start with the foundation, Layer 1 and Layer 2. The document categorizes these as community data and church data.
Layer 1 is community data. This is the analysis of where the church or the organization physically lives. What is the actual geography outside your front doors? To explain why this matters, the text introduces a concept called the theology of proximity.
The theology of proximity. Okay, unpack the mechanics of that.
It's rooted in the doctrine of the incarnation, the Christian belief that the Word became flesh and dwelt among humanity. Mechanically, the incarnation proves that God works in specific, concrete locations. He didn't dictate salvation from a distant, abstract void. He entered a specific Middle Eastern culture. He spoke a specific regional dialect of Aramaic. He walked on real, dusty roads. He was deeply embedded in a local context.
But the text argues that modern organizations often do the exact opposite.
Yes. The author points out a devastating irony. Modern churches often deeply romanticize distant global missions.
Yeah.
They will raise hundreds of thousands of dollars for initiatives across the globe while remaining functionally blind and sometimes even apathetic to the people living within a 2-mile radius of their own building.
If you think about the psychology of that, it makes perfect sense. It is so much easier and requires so much less personal friction to get excited about funding a water well in a country you will never visit than it is to walk across the street, knock on the door of an immigrant neighbor you don't understand, and navigate the messy, awkward reality of an actual relationship.
That's entirely it.
Global missions can be kept neat and tidy in a newsletter. Local proximity requires you to actually change your daily lifestyle.
That is a brilliant observation. Distance provides a buffer against the messiness of actual human need. And so, layer one demands that organizations strip away that buffer and ask incredibly hard, data driven questions about their immediate geography.
Like what?
What languages are actually spoken at the grocery store down the street? What are the specific economic pressures of this exact zip code? Are there newly arrived diaspora communities settling nearby? Is the neighborhood rapidly gentrifying and pushing out old residents? Or is it an aging community with a lot of isolated seniors?
And the scary thing is, a lot of leadership teams think they already know the answers to these questions just because they drive to the building every Sunday.
But they don't. You cannot assume you know the neighborhood just because your institution's building has been parked on that corner for 50 years. Demographics shift constantly.
Yeah, they really do.
The text delivers a massive gut punch here. It says, a church cannot love what it refuses to see.
Oof.
Right. If you don't actually know the demographic shifts happening around you, your local mission strategy isn't based on reality. It's based on a nostalgic fantasy of what the neighborhood used to look like in 1995.
A church cannot love what it refuses to see. If that doesn't make you reconsider how you interact with your own neighborhood, nothing will. But okay, once you map the outside world, you have to turn the mirror inward, which leads directly into layer two, church data, moving from the community geography to the congregation itself.
Right. And layer two addresses a phenomenon the text calls the blindness of assumption.
Unpack that. What are we assuming?
We assume that what we want to do is what we are equipped to do. Churches, and again, this applies perfectly to startups or nonprofits, often fundamentally confuse aspiration with capacity.
Aspiration versus capacity.
Yes. Aspiration is the dream, is what the leadership wants to do. Capacity is the reality. It is what God has actually equipped them to do based on the literal skills, time, and resources of the people currently sitting in the room.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because if I'm a leader trying to figure out my capacity, my immediate instinct is to look at the market leaders.
Sure.
I'm going to look at a highly successful mega church in a major city or a massively successful global nonprofit, and I'm just going to copy their exact ministry model. If they have a thriving, highly produced youth program or an amazing community coffee shop outreach that's getting great results, why reinvent the wheel? Just download their PDF, follow their 10-step plan, and do it here.
And the text utterly systematically dismantles that instinct.
Right.
Oh, absolutely. It argues that copying external models almost always leads to organizational failure. Why? Because it completely ignores the hidden wealth already present in your specific, unique congregation.
Explain the mechanics of that failure. Why does the copy-paste method break down?
Because if you just copy a model from a church in a different city, you are inevitably trying to force your specific people into a mold they were never designed to fit. You are ignoring their actual gifts to serve a prefabricated system.
It's like trying to build an interlocking network of computers, but you bought all the hardware for a massive centralized server farm, and you're trying to force it to run a decentralized blockchain.
Exactly.
The architecture fundamentally rejects the software you're trying to install.
That is a great analogy. The hardware doesn't match the software. To illustrate how to do this correctly, the text points to a famous incident in the book of Acts, chapter 6. The early church was growing rapidly, and a logistical dispute arose because Greek-speaking widows were being neglected in the daily distribution of food. The apostles, who were leading the movement, had a crisis on their hands.
And what's fascinating is what they didn't do.
Right.
They didn't import a Roman administrative system. They didn't hire an outside consulting firm from Alexandria to come in and audit their food supply.
Exactly. They recognized a specific local need, and then they looked inward at their own capacity. They asked the community to identify 7 qualified, gifted people who were already sitting in their midst to handle the logistics. They deployed the hidden wealth they already possessed.
So gathering church data literally means taking an inventory of the human beings in the room.
Yes. A congregation of 200 people might have 3 bilingual members who speak the exact dialect of the immigrant community down the street. They might have a dozen retired nurses. They might have a handful of quiet people who dedicate hours a day to prayer. But if the leadership doesn't do the work to map these specific gifts, if they don't even know they have a brain trust of retired nurses sitting in the 3rd row every Sunday, those gifts remain entirely dormant.
Because the church is too busy trying to launch a tech-heavy media ministry. because that's what the cool church across the country is doing.
Exactly. They are burning out trying to be a media company when their actual hidden wealth is perfectly, miraculously suited to run a neighborhood medical clinic or a free ESL tutoring program. The rule of layer 2 is you have to map the body you actually have, not the body you wish you had.
There's something incredibly freeing about that realization.
Isn't there?
It completely removes the crushing pressure on leadership to be everything to everyone. You don't have to be the slick, hyper-modern organization if that's not who is in the room. You just have to be faithful and strategic with the specific tools currently in your hands.
It's the ultimate antidote to organizational envy.
But of course, to do anything, whether it's a medical clinic or a media ministry, you need resources and you need people to make the call.
Yes.
Dreams need dollars and they need decision makers. Which brings us to the ultimate reality check of this entire document. Once an organization maps who they are and where they have to face the brutal truth of how they spend their money and who actually holds the power.
Oh, this is the hard part.
Let's dive into layer 3 and layer 4. Budget data and leadership data. The text brilliantly refers to these two layers combined as the moral architecture of the organization.
Let's unpack the budget first, layer 3. The text makes a deeply provocative claim here that completely reframes how we think about finance. It argues that a budget is not an accounting document.
What is it then?
It is a moral record.
A moral record. Wow. If we were to look at your personal bank statement right now, listener, what would we assume your theology is? What would we assume your moral priorities are? That is a terrifying thought experiment.
It is terrifying because numbers don't lie. The author goes further and calls the budget a catechism.
A catechism.
Now, catechism in historical theology is a teaching tool, usually a series of questions and answers, designed to instill the core beliefs of the faith into the community through repetition. The text argues that your spreadsheet is acting as a catechism.
Okay, I see.
Every time you allocate funds, you are silently teaching the congregation what truly matters to the organization.
The mechanism of that is fascinating.
Yeah.
The budget teaches through financial repetition.
Right. The author reminds us that Jesus talked about money constantly more than almost any other topic because he understood the deep psychological link between finance and human affection. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
Yeah.
You can have the most beautiful, lofty mission statements printed on the wall of the lobby, but your budget exposes what you actually believe in the boardroom. The text has a striking phrase. A budget exposes what a church is willing to lose.
What you are willing to sacrifice. Because let's say a church's stated values. The things that pastor preaches about are reaching the lost and sacrificial service to the poor. But then you look at layer 3, the budget data. And 95% of the capital goes to maintaining a state-of-the-art indoor facility, upgrading the sound system, and making the environment highly comfortable for the people who are already on the inside. The budget is screaming the truth over the sound of the sermon.
Precisely. Overfunding highly visible, comfortable internal programs while consistently underfunding quiet, localized mercy ministries reveals a functional theology of self-protection and consumerism. The budget is where abstract theology hits concrete reality.
It really is.
If a church claims that training leaders is their highest priority, but they allocate $0 to leadership development, the budget is catechizing the congregation to understand that leadership is just a marketing buzzword, not an actual priority.
It's the ultimate lie detector test. You cannot fake a bank statement.
Nope.
And then right next to the money is the power. Layer 4 is leadership data. This explores the hidden architecture of decision-making, and the text takes a massive analytical swing at what it calls the heroic model of leadership.
The heroic model is arguably the most common default structure in passion-driven organizations, startups, and certainly in church planting. This is the model where a single, highly passionate, usually highly charismatic founder or lead pastor carries absolutely all the institutional weight.
They are the bottleneck for everything.
Everything. They make all the final decisions. They hold all the key donor relationships. They counsel all the staff. They cast all the vision. They are the undeniable center of gravity.
I want to expand on an analogy for this, drawing from the tech world again.
Go for it.
Think of the heroic model like a massive legacy mainframe computer system.
Right.
Every single terminal, every single piece of data, every single process has to route back through that one central mainframe to function.
Right.
Now, to the outside observer, that mainframe looks incredibly impressive. It's powerful, it's humming, it's doing a million calculations. But structurally, it is a single point of failure. The moment that mainframe overheats, whether from pastoral burnout, moral failure, or just sheer physical exhaustion, every single terminal goes dark simultaneously. Yeah. The entire system crashes.
That is an incredibly accurate visualization. The heroic model feels highly efficient in the short term, which is why we gravitate toward it. When one person is making all the calls, decisions are made fast. There's no bureaucratic red tape. A visionary can steer the ship on a dime.
Yeah, but at what cost?
Well, as your mainframe analogy shows, it creates extreme organizational vulnerability. It guarantees eventual burnout. The text argues that moving toward shared leadership is not a sign of a weak leader. It is the only biblically sound way to achieve resilience and long-term multiplication.
But this introduces a massive psychological friction, because if you are a founder or a visionary leader who birthed this organization out of your own blood, sweat, and tears, giving up control is terrifying.
Oh, completely.
It feels like you are compromising the purity of the vision.
Yeah.
How does an organization actually transition from the heroic mainframe model to a decentralized, shared leadership model without the whole thing falling apart?
This raises an important question, and the text provides a brilliant roadmap for this by examining the biblical story of Moses and his father-in-law, Jethro.
Oh, it's a great story.
Right. Moses is the ultimate heroic leader. He led an entire nation out of slavery. And the text describes a scene where Moses is sitting from morning until evening, personally judging every single dispute for hundreds of thousands of Israelites. The line of people waiting to see him is endless. He is the mainframe, and he is overheating.
And Jethro walks into the camp, takes one look at this logistical nightmare, and pulls Moses aside.
Jethro looks at him and says, "What you are doing is not good." And we have to pause and analyze the psychology of that statement. Jethro isn't saying Moses lacks devotion. Moses is arguably the most devoted man on earth at that moment. Jethro isn't questioning his theology or his calling. Jethro is saying Moses lacks architecture.
You're going to burn yourself out, and you're going to wear out all these people waiting in line.
Exactly. Devotion without architecture is unsustainable. So Jethro advises him to completely decentralize the system. He tells Moses to appoint capable, trustworthy leaders over thousands, over hundreds, over 50s, and over 10s.
That's amazing.
It is a masterclass in shared leadership and distributed computing. The text points out that if all meaningful knowledge, institutional memory, and authority live exclusively inside the head of one person, the ministry is inherently fragile.
So when an organization gathers leadership data, what specific questions are they asking to audit this?
They have to ask ruthless questions about power.
Yeah.
Who actually has the authority to make decisions without asking the founder? Who has the relational capital to look the lead pastor in the eye and correct them when they are wrong?
Those are tough questions.
Yes. Is there a documented succession plan? If the visionary founder gets hit by a bus tomorrow, does the mission continue seamlessly, or does the organization instantly dissolve? If the answer is that everything stops without the founder, you don't have a missional map. You have a personality cult disguised as a ministry.
Wow. A personality cult disguised as a ministry. That is a heavy, necessary diagnostic.
It really is.
Okay, so at this point in the process, an organization has done the excruciating internal work. We've mapped the external community geography, we've inventoried our internal human capacity, we've audited our financial moral record, and we've stress-tested our leadership architecture.
Right.
Now, the focus of the document shifts back outward. How do the everyday people in the seats actually interact with this mission, and how does the organization interact with the broader network of global partners?
Yeah.
This brings us to Layer 5 and Layer 6, participation data and partner data. The text beautifully refers to this as the living network.
Let's look at layer 5 first, participation data. This layer is entirely about defining the difference between watching the mission and actually living it. The text makes a razor-sharp, highly convicted distinction between mere attendance and true participation.
Let's break down the mechanics of attendance. Attendance is passive, it's event-based.
Right. The text argues that event-based Christianity or event-based volunteerism in any nonprofit context is dangerous because it creates a highly convincing illusion of involvement. Think about the psychology of a big event.
Okay.
People show up to the annual charity gala or the massive global missions Sunday at church. The music is great. The video presentation is emotionally manipulative in all the right ways. The speaker is incredibly compelling.
Yeah, you feel so fired up.
Exactly. The attendee feels a rush of inspiration. They drop a one-time check in the offering basket, and they go home feeling like they are a vital, active part of the mission.
They get the dopamine hit of accomplishment without actually having to change their daily habits.
Exactly. They consumed an experience. But participation, as defined by the text, is inherently costly. It is not an event, it is a way of life. It requires the slow, unglamorous friction of sustained habit.
I really appreciated how the text took time to validate what it called hidden faithfulness. Because in our social media-driven culture, when we think of someone participating in missions, we almost always default to the highly visible hero.
Right.
We picture the young, adventurous person standing on a stage in a foreign country, holding an orphan, posting incredible updates. We measure the spectacle.
Which completely ignores the actual backbone of the mission. The text elevates the hidden participants. It demands that we measure the person who quietly sets up an automatic recurring donation of $50 every month for a decade. It demands we measure the family that continually opens up their living room to host weary aid workers who need a place to sleep.
That's beautiful.
It points specifically to the older saint, the elderly man or woman who can no longer travel but who wakes up at 5 a.m. every single morning, pulls out a map, and faithfully prays for the political stability and spiritual health of specific nations.
That is true. Foundational participation. And in most organizational metrics, it goes completely uncounted because you can't put it on a glossy brochure.
And that is precisely why Layer 5 data collection is so vital. If your data only measures who showed up to the big spectacle events, you are optimizing your organization to produce consumers of religious entertainment.
Consumers.
Yeah. But if you begin to measure and celebrate the hidden faithfulness, who is praying consistently, who is giving sacrificially in the dark, who is quietly tutoring kids in the neighborhood, you begin to measure and cultivate the actual culture of the church. The goal isn't to drum up more frantic, exhausting activity. The goal is to form a resilient body of people who live the mission as a daily habit.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most logistically awkward layer of the entire map.
Layer 6.
Layer 6, partner data. This is about knowing exactly with whom we are joined in the work. And I have to say, the metaphor the author uses to describe how organizations handle legacy partnerships is nothing short of brilliant. The storage room metaphor.
It is painfully accurate for anyone who has been on a board or a leadership team for more than a decade. The text compares a church's historical list of supported missionaries and ministry partners to a household storage room or a garage. Think about how a storage room works.
Oh, I know how mine works.
Over the years, you accumulate boxes. You don't necessarily need what's inside them, but you keep them because they once mattered, or because the sheer thought of going through them and throwing things away feels emotionally exhausting and awkward.
Right. You open the door, and you've got a broken toaster you swore you'd fix, a tangled box of AV cables from a DVD player you threw away in 2004, some highly sentimental Christmas ornaments from your grandmother. It's just a museum of past intentions.
That is exactly how legacy organizations accumulate partnerships. They sponsor a specific missionary because 25 years ago, that person visited the church and gave a deeply compelling sermon.
Yeah.
Or a new pastor comes in and inherits a spreadsheet of global partners from the previous administration, and they don't want to rock the boat by questioning it. So the relationship is maintained purely through financial inertia.
Just on autopilot.
Right. An automated check goes out every month. But if you actually audit the relationship, the true relational connection, the bilateral communication, and the strategic alignment with the church's current vision have completely vanished. The partner has no idea what the church is doing locally, and the church have no idea if the partner is actually bearing fruit globally.
Okay, but this is where the rubber meets the road. And I want to push back on the mechanics of fixing this. Because if a leadership team realizes a partnership is just gathering dust in the storage room, what is the actual protocol?
It's tricky.
Do we just coldly cut ties? I mean, we are talking about real human beings, missionaries, field workers, or local nonprofits who rely on these funds to feed their families and keep the lights on. If our strategy shifts, do we just treat these people like discarded vendors whose contract didn't get renewed? That feels incredibly corporate and entirely unchristian.
And the author anticipates that exact moral hesitation. To counter that cold corporate approach, the text emphasizes what it calls the theology of mutuality.
Okay, mutuality.
This is the core mechanism for how to handle the storage room. Partners are not vendors you hire to do religious work for you. They are co-laborers in a shared ecosystem. The goal of analyzing partner data isn't to coldly slash the budget to save a buck.
That's a relief.
Right. The goal is to replace unexamined sentimentality with actual active stewardship. And sometimes true stewardship means having the maturity to sit down and ask the uncomfortable why. Why are we still supporting this specific work? Is it still bearing fruit, or has the season passed? Are we aligned?
So how does that conversation actually happen without burning the bridge? What does graceful offboarding look like in this context?
It requires extreme transparency and grace. If a partnership is no longer aligned with the church's defined map, the loving, faithful thing to do is to initiate an honest conversation.
Like what?
It sounds something like, "We are so deeply grateful for the decades of shared history we have. We celebrate the fruit of what you have built. However, our organizational blueprint is shifting its focus to this new specific area, and we are no longer aligned in a way that allows for mutual active relationship.
Yeah.
So, to honor you, we are going to continue full funding for the next 6 to 12 months to give you ample runway to find new partners. But after that, we will be transitioning our support."
That is incredibly healthy. It honors the past, provides a soft landing, but protects the future.
Exactly. Keeping a dead partnership alive purely out of a desire to avoid an awkward conversation is actually a profound failure of stewardship. Because every dollar tied up in a sentimental, unaligned partnership is a dollar that God might be actively calling you to deploy toward an urgent, highly fruitful need right in front of you.
Wow. That requires a level of emotional maturity that most organizations, corporate or religious, simply do not have. It's so much easier to just keep writing the check, keep the storage room door closed, and ignore the mess.
It is.
But okay, let's step back and look at the macro picture. If a church or an organization actually commits to this grueling process, if they go through the painful, humbling work of gathering all 6 layers of this data, mapping the community, inventorying the church capacity, reading the budget as a moral document, stress testing the leadership architecture, measuring actual participation, and cleaning out the partner storage room, they're going to end up with an absolute mountain of information.
A literal mountain.
But as the text explicitly warns us, data is ultimately just numbers on a page until you learn how to make it speak. Which brings us to our final critical section, interpreting findings.
This is where the magic of the map happens, but it's also where the greatest danger of misinterpretation lies. The text stresses a fundamental rule. Data without doctrine can deeply mislead you.
Okay, what does that mean?
Numbers are just signals. They are indicators on a dashboard. They are not conclusions in and of themselves. They have to be interpreted through the lens of prayer, sound theology, and rigorously honest analysis.
The text gives a highly specific, deeply convicting hypothetical example of this exact danger. Let's walk through it. Imagine a church that finally does this 6-layer audit. They look at layer 3, their financial data, and they discover they give a massive, disproportionate amount of money to overseas global missions.
Right.
Now, on a spreadsheet, that looks like an absolute A+ gay. They are generous. But then they cross-reference that with layer 1, their community data, and they realize they have absolutely zero engagement, zero programs, and zero relationship with a large, newly arrived immigrant community living right outside their front doors.
Right. And how the leadership team interprets the friction between those two data points changes everything.
Exactly.
If they don't have theological discernment, the leadership might just look at the data, feel a massive wave of shame and panic, and make a reactionary decision. They might suddenly defund the overseas missionaries to free up cash to start a chaotic local program just to appease their guilt. They react out of a desire to fix a bad metric.
Which would be catastrophic for the overseas partners who did nothing wrong.
Yeah.
They get punished because the leadership panicked over a spreadsheet.
Exactly. The data misled them because they didn't filter it through wisdom. But with theological discernment, the leadership team looks at that exact same set of numbers and realizes something entirely different. They realize this isn't a malicious, systemic failure of their people. It's simply a blind spot.
A blind spot.
Their people clearly have a heart for the nations, which is why they give globally. They just haven't been taught how to apply that exact same heart locally.
Ah, so it's an integration problem, not a failure problem.
Yes. They don't need to pit global funding against local action. They need to integrate their global conscience with a local incarnational witness. The numbers didn't demand they abruptly stop global funding. The numbers provided an invitation for the leadership to expand the congregation's imagination to include their immediate neighbors.
Oh, that's good.
They can say, "You already care about people across the world. Let me introduce you to the same people who just moved in down the street."
That is such a nuanced, brilliant way to handle failure. And I love the specific phrase the text uses to describe this posture of interpretation, psalm-like honesty.
It's a beautiful concept.
For those listening who might not be familiar with the literary structure of the Psalms in the Bible, the writers of those ancient poems are brutally, shockingly honest. They do not sugarcoat their reality. They write openly about terror, about profound moral failure, about feeling abandoned, about deep organizational confusion.
Hmm.
But, and this is the key, they also never lose their ultimate hope in God's sovereignty. They hold despair and hope in the same breath.
And interpreting organizational data requires that exact same posture. Soam-like honesty means you refuse to panic when the data shows you are failing, but you also absolutely refuse to live in institutional denial. You look at the brutal facts of your budget,
Yeah.
your leadership bottlenecks, and your neighborhood demographics,
Mm.
and you present the reality of your organizational flaws to God without flattening the experience or making excuses. That posture is what allows a leadership team to distinguish a true moral failure requiring repentance from a simple strategic misalignment requiring a pivot.
It's the ultimate fusion of absolute truth and absolute grace.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, from defining the burden, to building the blueprint, to gathering the 6 layers of data, to interpreting those findings with psalm-like honesty, it is all ultimately about achieving a state of institutional maturity. It's about reaching a point where a church or a nonprofit or even a family can confidently point to its actual verifiable work and say, this is exactly what we were doing and this is why. It transforms vague religious sentiment or vague humanitarian intentions into disciplined, visible love.
Disciplined, visible love. What a profoundly challenging phrase to end our analysis on.
Okay.
Okay, let's synthesize this incredible journey we've been on today. We started by confronting the subtle danger of good intentions. How a vague burden without a structural blueprint just leads to exhausted firefighters chasing smoke on the horizon while the house burns down. We learn why strategy isn't a dirty corporate word, but an actual, deeply spiritual discipline of stewardship that recognizes our finite limits.
Exactly.
We walked through the 6 critical layers of organizational data. We learned the theology of proximity by mapping our community. We recognized our internal church capacity instead of copying external models. We read our budget not as a spreadsheet, but as a moral catechism. We audited our leadership for the hidden fragilities of the heroic mainframe model. We learned to track true hidden participation versus passive event-based attendance. And we discussed the incredibly awkward but necessary task of cleaning out the legacy partner storage room with grace. And finally, we finished with the art of interpreting all those raw findings with psalm-like honesty, avoiding the extremes of panic and denial.
It is a profound, exhaustive roadmap for moving from mere inspiration to actual, lasting incarnation. It takes the invisible and makes it brilliantly, uncomfortably visible.
It really does. And so, as always, we turn directly to you, our listener. We want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day or as you head into your next board meeting. Think about your own life, your own career trajectory, or your own community initiatives. Where you're currently running on the fumes of a burden without having done the hard, humbling work of drawing a blueprint. Are you just reacting to whoever asks for help first, driven by the dopamine of busyness, or do you actually have a map?
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer.
And I want you to look closely at your own schedule or your own personal bank account this week. Where is there a storage room of unexamined habits or sentimental partnerships that are quietly tying up your finite time and resources? Resources that you could be redeploying towards something that is actively currently bearing fruit right in front of you.
It fundamentally comes down to a question of stewardship. Are we intentionally managing the finite resources we've been given with cruciform clarity, or are we just coasting on the momentum of habit?
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, having a deep, burning passion to build a house, but refusing to draw a blueprint, just leaves you standing in a pile of very expensive wood, completely exhausted with nowhere to live. It takes immense courage to stop swinging the hammer wildly and sit down to draw the map. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of faithfulness. Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking beneath the surface of the institutions around you, and we will see you on the next deep dive.